Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the very far north by Kupyansk, where the Ukrainians have launched a counterattack in the direction of Avdiivka. After over a week of fighting, the Ukrainians have managed to push back the Russians slightly here to the north of Avdiivka, southwest of Counterattack, where they've managed to recapture these trenches which were built to the south of Counterattack, protecting the southern flank. The Russians here made a mistake once they captured Avdiivka, which was that they had prepared for Ukrainian counterattacks and managed to capture the hill and forest line here to the west of Avdiivka, but they left their northern flank exposed with only one line of defense, which was the trench network, which was already built in a sense where the northern parts is more exposed than the southern parts, and as such the Ukrainians were able to launch a successful counterattack, recapturing the trenches, where instead I advocated for the Russians to launch an assault here to the north, capturing this forest line here to the south of Counterattack, cutting off the supplies to Counterattack, and preparing a second line of defense in case of Ukrainian counterattack from the north, which was obviously coming, considering the fact that the Russians made this successful advance, and based on the evidence we've seen so far from how the Ukrainians act in these scenarios, is that they always launch a counterattack to recapture positions with their elite soldiers. However, to the south, we see that there has been no developments for the Russians. They have not made any advancements since the capture of Avdiivka, and as such, it is likely that the fighting taking place was just enough for the Russians to handle until this point where the Ukrainians successfully counterattacked. This means that the Russians simply do not have enough forces committed to deal with the Ukrainian counterattack, or the Ukrainians just simply keep sending reinforcements until they succeed. Either way, the Ukrainians have met success recapturing their fortified position to the north of Avdiivka, putting the Russian positions here in a very dangerous position, as there are just a few, well, this is pretty much it, only forest line, no fortifications or anything, clearly to resupply Avdiivka, and as such the Russians could lose their positions in Avdiivka if they do not counter the counterattack that the Ukrainians successfully captured these fortified positions to the north of Avdiivka. We then move south in the direction of Terny, where we recently saw these advancements by the Russians, and in this footage here, geolocated footage, we see that the advancements by the Russians were successfully recorded, and as such the Russians are now a bit closer to Terny than before. Moving further south in the direction of Bakhmut, the Russians launched a counter to the counterattack of the Ukrainians, where they managed to get a foothold here by the forest lines, but with this the Russians have recaptured the forest lines and may stage further operations in a southern direction as fighting over Avdiivka continues. So far it has been fairly stable with a bit of back and forth, no significant changes, but we will see if anything will change in the next coming days and weeks, if the Russians are planning on any sort of offensive here, or the Ukrainians planning a counterattack. Otherwise, the positional fighting will likely continue with no significant developments. Moving further south in the direction of Avdiivka, we have the main parts of this update. We start out in the direction of the north, where there has been two separate Russian advancements after they managed to capture the railway bridge. The first one is moving in a northern direction in the Dacha area. This shows that the Russians have an interest in creating this sort of wall between the Avdiivka coke plant and the areas to the south of it. So we see that the Russians are moving in a southwestern direction, not just to create this wall around the coke plant, but also to cut off the supply route in and out of Avdiivka. This has forced the Ukrainians to use their withdrawal from the central parts of Avdiivka to, instead of going in a northern direction through the main roads, to go through this road here to the north of Avdiivka, the citadel area. And as we can see, it is a paved road moving into a dirt road further westwards. So with this, we see that's pretty much the only route in and out of Avdiivka left for the Ukrainians to use. Is this one north of the citadel area, which is a dirt road, and with the weather becoming rainy today, in the next coming of days, filled with rain, it'll become muddy, and it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to move in and out of the city. We do see that the Ukrainians, during their withdrawal from the front line, are mining all of the buildings and areas around it, which means that the Russians will likely have a slow advance even if the Ukrainians withdraw. And if they do not withdraw, then they will have a slow advance nonetheless due to the fighting taking place. Very interesting facts about this, though, is this report by Deep State Map where they write about the Avdiivka area. They write on an analytical note, Avdiivka traditionally has the most difficult situation. Chaos reigns in the private sector and unpreparedness of the Ukrainians for fighting in urban conditions has been shown. Unfortunately, fires caused by strategic miscalculations have to be put out with human lives. It should be understood that the Russians have not yet used their main forces in the area. So the question arises as to how to stop them. The last movements of the enemy are designed to finally kill the logistics in the old Avdiivka. So far, the cost of the superior strength of the fighters of the 110th Mechanized Brigade, it is possible to hold the eastern face, which is practically unchanged. There is no living space here. This is exactly what the fighters themselves say about the city. We are repeating the mistakes we made in Bakhmut. Pretty much what is being said is that heavy fighting is taking place here in the northwest, where the Russians are looking to cut off the supply line. In the eastern parts, heavy fighting is taking place, but the Ukrainian soldiers of the 110th Mechanized Brigade are able to hold back any Russian advances. This is why we have seen fairly few advances in the east and in the south compared to the north. So what we're seeing is that the elite Ukrainian forces are here in the south and in the east, trying to hold the line at all costs, while the Ukrainians are sending additional reinforcements in the north. But these are not the elite soldiers, these are their foot soldiers. They are taking heavy casualties. That is exactly what the Ukrainians are saying, or Deep State Map is saying in this analytical note, is that the Ukrainians are simply sending as many soldiers as possible, using lives to hold territory, when in the end, as I quoted in a previous video, keep men, lose land, land can be taken again. Keep land, lose men, land and men are both lost. This is allegedly attributed to Mao Zedong, but the point being that the Ukrainians are simply sending additional soldiers to fill in the gaps when they don't have the fortified positions necessary, they don't have the equipment necessary, they don't have the supplies necessary, they don't have the necessary training, they don't have the necessary experience. All of these are thrown out of the window, while the Russian forces fighting here in the north are assault groups formed mostly of former Wagner soldiers. They have plenty of experience fighting in urban areas since they were fighting in the Bakhmut direction, and they have taught this experience to other Russian soldiers who are formed in groups with them, and the main force of the Russians haven't even entered the city yet. Based on all of this information, we can see that the situation is extremely dire for Avdiivka, and as Syriac Map said, this city, the battle of the city, has already been lost for the Ukrainians. It is not possible for them to win when they are suffering these defeats, filling in the gaps with whatever they can get their hands on of soldiers, with hardly any artillery support, with hardly any supplies, and the Russian main force has not even entered the battle yet. That is the situation. And taking into consideration the bombardment which is taking place here in the northern parts of Avdiivka, all the way from the train station and up to the coke plant, this area alone saw in the last hours of yesterday night heavy bombardments, and that is an understatement. The Russians launched about 100 FABs in just 8 hours. That is more than 10 FABs every hour. What we are seeing is that in an hour and a half from 22:30 to midnight, at least 26 FABs arrived. And they even mentioned that the last series was especially strong, perhaps more than 500. Could be the FAB 1500s, which I have started production. So we're seeing extremely heavy bombardments. An hour and a half, that's 90 minutes, 26 FAB bombs. That's about 3 FAB bombs every 10 minutes or 1 every 3 minutes. That is the entire arsenal of the Russian FABs just being concentrated in the Avdiivka area in such a small portion of the front line. No matter how much experience, how much equipment, whatever the Ukrainians have available in that area, it does not stand a chance against this heavy bombardment. And with this, we see that the situation is becoming ever increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to achieve anything of significance in the final days and weeks of the Battle of Avdiivka. Because who knows how much longer this will take, considering the Ukrainians are just sending additional soldiers to the front line. We will likely see that the Ukrainians will attempt to launch some sort of counterattack on the flanks to kind of alleviate the situation in the center, possibly to cover for a withdrawal of the Ukrainian elite forces from the center of Avdiivka, from the east and the south, and replace them with weaker units with less equipment and so on, so that they can hold the line for as long as possible for the elite forces to go out. We've seen that the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the 110th Mechanized Brigade, and additional forces are fighting in this section of the front. And if they are able to get out, then the Ukrainians will consider it a successful withdrawal, regardless of what other costs it may take. We then move on to the direction of Rehorivka, here to the northwest of Marinka, where this advance, which I reported on yesterday, has been geolocated and geoconfirmed with this recent footage, as is shown on the screen here. So with this, we see confirmation of this advancement, which was reported on. And then we move on to the final advance, which is here by Uroshaine, where the Ukrainians managed to capture this fortification of the Russians, allowing the Ukrainians to alleviate some pressure from Uroshaine with the flank now under their own control. They can continue pressuring the Russian forces in the area and restart offensive operations here if necessary. So with this, the Ukrainians have pretty much consolidated their positions in Uroshaine. There are still some threats to the positions in Seremayovsk, with this northwestern direction being under Russian control, but that is a story for another time. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.